Hey folks, today we got Ron Kohl on talking about space workers and what the workforce of tomorrow is going to look like. But first, let me thank our sponsor. Voices from L5 is brought to you by the National Space Society, a member-supported nonprofit organization working to accelerate humankind's future in space through policy advocacy and thought leadership. All NSS members receive Ad Astra, our award-winning quarterly magazine focused on the future of space exploration and settlement. To support the National Space Society as a member or volunteer, please go to www.nss.org. Thanks.
The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
So one of my areas of interest is the long-term ongoing human settlement of outer space, and that includes workforces, families, the creation of real settlements, not just a scientific or a commercial outpost. And towards that end, it seems quite reasonable to expect that we will need a workforce as we get more and more people either very long-term or permanently settled in outer space to take care of the day-to-day needs of a community. Everything from sealing up cracks in the windows and the roofs to providing air and power and water and sort of the basic infrastructure services, and then supporting whatever kind of commerce or research that might be going on. I'm sure we'll have collections of communities that have commerce and scientific research and probably other stuff we haven't thought of yet, and all of that will require repair people and technicians and adjudicators and a myriad of other things we haven't yet to think of.
Right. So I mean, the crux of it is when we're in space, we're going to need the same sort of people that we have down here on Earth doing the same sort of jobs that we have down here on Earth.
I think that's correct. I think obviously we're going to have some new jobs because of the environment of space and some of the factors of outer space that are different here on Earth, but I don't see hardly any of the things we have here on Earth not also being needed in outer space.
Now, one of the interesting things about this subject that I find is that I don't think there's been many times in human history where you sort of have what we have now, where you have sort of a workforce in space. It's just a very, 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 very specific and specified job skills, I suppose, that you could have to work in space. And should things all go the way that we all hope they do, this expands pretty rapidly into almost every job sector. You know, right now, if you want to go into space, you need to be a very, very specialized scientist in some way or a very specialized engineer. And both of those paths, you also need to have many, many years of experience working in very specified environments. Or you get lucky and you get picked to get fired up in a rocket. But either way, it's not quite the same as, say, on Earth, where if you want to weld, for example, you learn how to weld and you're 90% of the way there, right?
Right.
So what do you see as the first sort of steps to this? Like, how does this workforce begin to exist? Do you see that the need for specialized training in the early days? Or, I mean, obviously, if we look at, I want to make a joke about that movie Armageddon now, but presumably there'll need to be some specialized training for these jobs, but are we looking at a similar situation with astronauts where you're picking out the best of the field and training them in the specified routes of being in space? Or will we see new disciplines arrive and people having to learn very rapidly on the job instead?
All right, so my answer to your second last question is no. I think one of the points that when I talk to people about this that some people find irritating is that the future workforce in outer space, in my opinion, will look very little like our current astronaut corps. We will not take astronauts and train them to do welding or cleaning hotel rooms or serving food. We will take people that have those technical skills and train them to do that in outer space, you know, from low Earth orbit all the way to the moon and Mars. So my opinion is that we will look to the technical skills community, the trades, the junior and community colleges that have apprenticeship programs and teach technical skills as the predominant source of this future workforce, just as we do today in the construction industry and in the hotelry industry and those kind of industries, all of which I expect to become prevalent eventually in outer space. So my advice to my aerospace engineers friends is, if you plan to be part of going to outer space, then you should learn two new skills, neither of which have to do with aerospace engineering.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. So the idea then being that we take the people who already have those core skills and sort of add on the extra space bit rather than start with the space bit and add on the core skills. That makes a lot of sense.
And again, that won't be we will in fact take our current concept of astronauts and maybe even a few aerospace engineers into space, but as we grow communities in outer space, even as we start with ever growing commercial and scientific outposts, say on the moon, we're going to need more and more service people, repair people, infrastructure people, and those will not come out of the traditional astronaut corps or the aerospace engineering community.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, it would be, I think, again, the Armageddon thing again is there's that famous quote where one of the actors asked the director why they would teach drillers to be astronauts and not just teach astronauts to be drillers. In this case, we're sort of going with the reverse, that it doesn't quite make a lot of sense to, teach astronauts to do all of the fairly complex and, tasks that require a lifetime to master. Instead, we could just get the people who have those tasks and put them in space. I mean, at this point in time that we're envisioning, I imagine these colonies or these settlements are at least somewhat closer to what we expect to be experiencing on Earth than the ISS right now. You can imagine them being a little bit more habitable, I guess would be the word.
Yes, I believe that's to be true.
So one of the areas that that I'm interested in, at least personally, on Earth-based stuff is workers' rights. I'm very invested in that area of social justice and what have you. And so when we talk about space labor, one of the things that immediately comes to mind for me is the various workers' rights and the needs of workers in space. We had an episode early on where we talked about the various societal differences with a space colony versus an Earth colony. And one of those things that we came up with is that in space, a lot of the human rights, the things that we don't even put down on documents because they're so innately obvious, things like clean air and gravity, are actually controlled by someone or a group of someone's on a space station. And so that leads to, a great deal of differences in what you consider your rights and your freedoms and what, say, a constitution might look like with those things in mind. With that in mind, what sort of extra protections or rights do you see happening with workers in space?
So I think that's a hard problem to solve because, again, we the human race haven't done this reasonably large migration to a distant place in quite some time. I mean, I like to argue these kind of things by historical analogies, and if you think about America's migration west, over the Appalachians, across the plains, over the Rockies, out to the Pacific, that didn't happen overnight or, in a few years. That happened over decades. And as we started moving more and more people west, the railroads came in. Well, then there were labor issues, as I expect there will be as we move into outer space. So I think a lot of this, I think it's a good idea to be talking about it now because it's not clear to me that, if you create a spaceport in lunar orbit, that the Air Traffic Controller Union will be the first thing to show up, but I'll bet you it's not the last thing to show up. Mm-hmm. And maybe the longshoremen will become interested, and maybe the Teamsters will become interested. When you start creating tourist hotels, I suspect the hotel industry unions will become interested. So I think that we should expect and assume that, labor issues, including but not limited to labor unions, will appear over time. And I think it sort of depends on, where these communities and what these communities do will help to determine, what kind of labor force shows up, and then what kind of labor issues and challenges they bring with them. So I think it's important to start thinking about now, so that, when the first mining crew shows up on the lunar surface, there's not an argument about, do I get a 15-minute break every 3 hours?
Right, right, right. I think we can, if we're using historical models to sort of look at this, I think we can sort of point to the long-term contracts that happen when we send sort of oil rig workers off to fairly dangerous and cold and remote parts of like Alaska and the ocean, where they receive extra pay. And I also think they're all very well unionized, those various oil rig workers and what have you. So we could maybe delve into their protections and see how they apply to something like being shipped off to the moon to work.
And to be honest, I think that would be a good model. For example, let's assume we're going to do mining on pretty much every planetary body that has interesting things to mine. We're going to take the mining community with us as we know and love it today, including their workforce and probably the labor rules under which that workforce. So where we take an existing workforce with us, such as mining, I think we should be prepared and expect that we will take with us issues for people who represent the workforce as well as the company. And so I think, looking back at how did labor unions and labor issues surface amongst the mining and the railroad, transportation, all those different communities that we are likely to see commercially in outer space, I think can provide us some guidance. Now, obviously, things are different in outer space, but some of those early days I think are going to look more like here on Earth than we think they will.
I think that's definitely right. So when I announced that we were doing our episode on space labor at last, I got one or two questions from listeners, and I'd like to field one of them to you if you don't mind.
Not at all.
One of our listeners emailed in and was talking a little bit about the various issues that we see on Earth with our labor issues right now. And she made the interesting point that going into space right now, and the general space industry is one of the industries that diversification doesn't happen all that much just yet. They made the point that it's very difficult for minorities and women to break into that field right now, for various reasons. But they were wondering if you saw the sort of opening of space to all of these various other industries, all these various other technical disciplines, as allowing that sort of glass ceiling to be broken for various to allow more of a diverse group of people to work in space.
I think we should expect that to happen, and I think it will be primarily due because we're going to get more of the workforce as the workforce grows in outer space from the technical skills community, not the engineering college graduate community. And I think, if you look at, plumbers and electricians and HVAC and welders and concierge attendants, you're going to see much greater industry there than you might see today, in aerospace engineering. That's not a fact. That's just my limited observation. But I think because we're going to get a more diverse workforce from a more diverse base, I think we should expect more diversity. To me, that seems quite logical and something we should plan for. I mean, some industries are better at it, some industries are not, but we should look at all sides.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It was an interesting conversation, but it made me think about more of these issues that we have on Earth around labor right now. I mean, labor right now on Earth is, especially in the U.S., is a sort of tumultuous beast as far as the social aspect of it goes. So there's a lot of people campaigning now for better workers' rights. You've got the Fight for 15 going on in various parts of the U.S. You've got in the last 10, 20, 30 years, you've seen labor unions lose a great deal of their power due to federal interference, and it's a very interesting landscape that we have here on Earth, and it makes me immediately think about what adding this whole new, how would you even refer to it, a whole new workspace, a whole new area that to send people off to work in. a whole new job market, I suppose. Introducing a whole new job market to all of this chaos could create more and more interesting issues that would arise out of it.
Well, I fully agree. And I think it's important to also recognize now, again, for those of us who think we should be planning for this, not just waiting for it to happen, that we're going to have a variety of international contributors, both governments and industries, and they will bring along their concept of labor workforce and labor laws and labor unions or the opposition thereof. So, looking just, so you looking at what we do here in the US will be good for when our US mining companies or tourist companies take their workforce to an orbiting hotel or to the lunar surface. But we have to acknowledge that other countries and other companies who don't do what we do will also be there. Maybe they'll be there first. And we need to be prepared ahead of time to deal with potential conflicts and clashes uh, at a reasonably distant and remote place.
It makes me wonder if this doesn't if this isn't an opportunity or wouldn't be an opportunity to sort of equalize the rights of various labor markets and workers in space. If, say, a lot of Chinese labor moves to space and a lot of Indian labor moves to space and a lot of US labor moves to space, I feel like if those groups are intermingling and working in very similar conditions and working maybe even in the same, habitats, depending on how these habitats come about, I wonder what their rights eventually end up being. I can't imagine a lot of American workers would be happy working for, wages similar to what the Chinese workers could be expecting to be making. But at the same breath, I can't imagine Chinese workers, upon working with American workers, would be very happy with the wages they'll be getting.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate issue to be thinking about now. And my opinion on how to start worrying about that now is to go look at places around the world that are reasonably remote or challenging or difficult or hazardous, where we have these international workforces and compare those against, say, a mining operation in Montana, where we probably have mostly Americans, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
and to look at, how did the community deal with it? How did the corporation or the collaboration or consortium deal with it? How did the government of wherever this happened, whether you're offshore, in the North Sea or in the African desert or above the Arctic Circle, these are places where different cultures and economic models sometimes clash and collide, and sometimes not so friendly.
Right, right. It reminds me of a story my grandfather used to tell me about. He was originally a engineer that worked in training various people in Saudi Arabia following one of their conflicts there, and he trained them how to work on aircraft basically. And he used to tell me how difficult it was to sort of, well, I mean, there was a language barrier there, obviously, but one of the more big issues that he had was just a social difference between him and the Saudi Arabian folks, especially once he realized that he was making so much more money than they were. And when they realized that as well, there was a sort of conflict going on there. And it makes me wonder what that sort of might look like when you're talking about such a grand scale of space.
And again, I think that's another legitimate issue that should be put on the list now, so that as we start to plan for these future communities and the supporting workforce, we don't wait until everybody shows up at a mining camp on the moon prospecting ice or helium-3 and saying, well, we get we only work 8 hours and we get an hour for lunch.
Mm,
And somebody else says, well, we work 12 hours nonstop. And
exactly.
I'm sure that's going to be a conflict of some sort.
Right, right, right. So let's wheel back a little bit. There's lots of interesting things in the sort of justice section of the workers' rights, but I want to roll back a little bit. You've been talking about civilian workforces for a long time in space, and in one of the pieces of material you sent over to me, it has a section on who are the civilian workers, the civilian space workers. I think that's a very good question. I'd like you to just talk a little bit about where you think this workforce comes from. Who are they? What disciplines are we going to need in space?
Well, I think the easiest way or here's the way that I came up with who I think the answers to those questions is to envision what does the community, the settlements, the outposts, call them what you want. Again, I'm thinking all the way to permanent, self-sustaining human settlements,
Mm.
but there are going to be stepping stones on the way. And as each of these stepping stones gets established and matures and evolves and expands, what is the workforce we're going to need? And and I'm a big fan of looking at the infrastructure services, the utilities, the power, the air, the water, the sewage, radiation protection, of course, as we get outside of our Earth orbit. Um, and what are the amenities we have when we get to these places? So, for a long time, I always used to use the South Pole as an interesting example of a scientific but outpost. But yet, the tourist industry to um, the South Pole has grown by orders of magnitude, and it's quite expensive and quite dangerous. But tens of thousands of people go there on a regular basis. So there's an example of what was one of the most remote places on the planet. Somebody thought, maybe there's a few people interested. That industry grew
Right.
phenomenally, in my opinion, and now there is a South Pole tourism industry that is quite robust, compared to what it used to be a decade ago. And so I see that, as these communities evolve and expand, we're going to need people to, take care of habitats. If there's a tourist hotel, then, go on a business trip and look around you sometimes, not just at the hotel, but you have hotel parking, so there's transportation needs. Uh, you know, Looking at sort of the everyday life of when you travel or when you walk around your own community, I think becomes a very good model for the kind of skills and services we should expect to see as we eventually evolve into a full-blown human settlement in outer space.
Right, right. I mean that does make a lot of sense that the vast majority of jobs are, to use maybe the wrong word, a little mundane to what people might expect for space jobs. I'm sure when people think about the sort of jobs you can have in space, they're sort of thinking about astronauts right now, where they're these very exciting, very big picture sort of career paths where they're doing a lot of important work. But I forget who said it, but in one episode, someone did mention, you have to have someone who keeps the lights on, and that's just as vitally important as doing all the scientific research in the world.
Right. I One of the things in one of the presentations that I've written about this, I talk about sealants and lubricants as two critical technologies that are going to, I think, in once we get people permanently or long term in outer space on the moon or wherever, everybody's going to walk around with some sort of high technology caulking gun in case you're the one that walks up on a leak. And we have already heard from people who have put the rovers on the planets, on the moon and Mars, that the dust and other contaminants makes a really hard lubricant problem, and there are a lot of people looking at that. And again, I think the repair people that are going to tag along with even with robotic machinery and mining things will have a certain toolkit that probably won't look exactly like the ones they wear here on Earth. They'll have wrenches and screwdrivers and crowbars and hammers, but they'll probably have a couple of things that are unique to the outer space environment.
Hmm. Now, speaking of unique, the thing that pops into my mind is that we mentioned it a little bit earlier, a little offhandedly, but there will be new jobs, the jobs that we don't have now, careers and disciplines that we just don't have any of on Earth. It makes me think about, someday in the future they'll have to be someone who is both technically sound, in the sense that they have the same sort of skill set as a plumber or a HVAC technician or something like that, someone who's handy, but will also have to have some fairly high level physics background. Say the person who has to manage the rotation on the settlement. These settlements, they produce gravity via rotation motion. The person who has to manage that, or the team that has to manage that, will have to have a very, very strong physics background while also being very, very engineering and technically handy. It's just interesting to think about those multi-disciplines coming together. I think you mentioned in one of the slides in your presentation that we're going to be looking at more and more multidisciplinary people who have various different skill sets from various different worlds coming together.
Yeah, I think you hit on a great point in that while we may not be sending aerospace engineers as we know and love them today to do their aerospace engineering design fabrication, we're certainly going to need some of that knowledge to help, build or rebuild or repurpose salvageable stuff in outer space. And and again, I think they're going to have to know how to operate wrenches and torque rods and things that are more technician oriented, not always associated with aerospace engineering as we know it. But I think the people that have we're going to need musicians,
Mm.
and if you have a musician who also knows something about air conditioning or plumbing, I'm guessing he's going to the top of the list to go first.
That's right. I wonder that brings up an interesting point. When companies or governments start to think about where these people are going to come from, what do you see that selection process like? You mentioned that a musician who knows how to use a wrench is probably at the top of the list. Do you see it as sort of a big list of skills and peoples that we need being compared with the best in the world, or is this going to be something where you apply for the job and cross your fingers?
Well, so the model that I use to try to answer that question is to look at those industries that go to hazardous, dangerous places like the North Sea and the African desert and above the Arctic Circle or
Mm.
the North Slope of Alaska. And my limited understanding, so I'm not an expert in this area, but through some anecdotal conversations, many of those people get picked because they're not only good at something, but they want to go do that. They're not intimidated by the environment, and I think that's going to be key criteria, at least in the early days. I think over decades when we get a larger population and it becomes in fact less dangerous or hazardous or whatever you wish to call it, I think that criteria might diminish a little bit. But if you don't like to go to outer space, then this is probably not the job for you.
Hmm. So let's move on into a little bit of what the next steps are. What are we going to be looking at? What do you see as some of the new trends you're going to see emerging in the workforce, given a space marketplace opening up? We already mentioned more people with multi-disciplines going on. Is there any other areas you see expanding and growing, or new trails being blazed in the workforce?
Well, so I think my opinion is that looking at the new emerging technologies that are going to be either new or different for outer space, for example, fuel depots. The concepts that I have seen about fuel depots is that they're going to be a big giant fuel tank someplace, cryogenic fuel. So we have to have the ability to create these things, perhaps say in a lunar orbit or in an L1 or L2 position or someplace. We'll probably put it near a space transportation hub. That would make sense. And then we have to figure out how to transfer fuel. That is a non-trivial exercise involving laws of physics and chemistry and the behavior of fluids at reasonably cold temperatures.
Mm.
And then there's going to be some electromechanical devices, components. It's not all going to be digital. There's going to be pumps and valves and nuts and bolts, and so we need to have people who understand valves and nuts and bolts, as well as software and computers. We will have all of that in spades in outer space. And so again, if you go back to what is it that we would like to have our residents, our workforce, our scientists to be able to do if they're on the moon or someplace else for an extended period of time, it's not just the technical job. People want to walk away after 8 hours or whatever, and they want to go to a museum or a restaurant or a bar. And if those things are not planned as part of the outpost or the eventual settlement, then shame on the planners, in my opinion.
Right, right, right. I think that makes a lot of sense. Jared O'Neill in his book The High Frontier, I think he talks very deeply about the need for those sorts of recreational facilities on space stations and space settlements. He talks about, movie theaters and what have you being just as vitally important as any of the other facilities. And I think that's totally right. Humans need that downtime, that recreation, and they need something to do during that downtime and that
Right.
recreation.
And again, they're going reasonably remote. So, I don't know what the people that, I don't know what they do for fun on the North Slope of Alaska, but I would guess they must do a lot of fun stuff when you don't have to be drilling all day out in the tundra.
Right, right. And another thing we don't talk about too often as well is that we have to remember that the entertainment industry here on Earth is probably one of the biggest industries on the planet. It makes billions and billions and billions of dollars worldwide. It makes me think that on a space settlement, I don't see the entertainment industry missing out on that potential revenue stream. If you're talking about a settlement of 10,000 people, hypothetically, and you are building the only movie theaters on there, well, that's 10,000 people who are going to be going to your movies pretty much on the regular.
Yeah, well, and again, I think you have to look at the full scope of, what happens, what do you do on a typical week in your community, wherever your community is. You go to sporting events, you watch TV, you go to the movies, you go to restaurants, you go to museums, you go to, you have beer making clubs, whatever you do, you almost have to assume we're going to replicate and expand that as we get more and more humans with more and more backgrounds out in outer space. And again, you know, if Anaconda Mining is the first one to land on the moon and they take 10 people and they build an outpost to muck around with the lunar surface, they'll have some amount of control. But as the next mining company or other industries start showing up and trying to lay claim and arguing about property rights, and our workforce doesn't work 12 hours a day while yours does, as these things grow, if we don't think about how to deal with those conflicts and issues and differences now, then shame on us. I mean, we know they're going to happen, and ignoring them until they happen seems to be bad planning.
It's always the most interesting part of space settlement, for me at least, talking about it and running this show, is that we have an opportunity here that isn't often given to us in history, that we can see something coming. We know, reasonably speaking, so long as, everything doesn't go to hell in the next couple of years, in the next couple of decades, we know that humanity will eventually live in these places. We'll eventually settle them at some point in time. It might be, 100 years from now, it might be 500 years from now, but we know it'll happen at some point. It offers us this opportunity to plan for it and to look ahead and to lay down a groundwork for something that isn't there yet, which isn't something we often get. It's just something that I find very interesting.
No, I agree. And I think that whole concept of planning ahead for, as you say, something we believe will almost happen with dead certainty, but may take decades, perhaps. But it presents new challenges. So, so going off to the North Slope of Alaska was quite adventurous for the first crew that showed up, because there was nothing there but snow and ice, and they turned it into a quite a robust community. There's thousands of people, maybe more, and that is out in the middle of pretty much nowhere. And we have many other instances, mining companies in the north of in the Canadian tundra and the deserts and North Sea. So we have this concept of going somewhere for the first time. It's often commercially oriented, for profit companies. But once somebody gets there and becomes successful, then it's not unusual that everybody else wants to go there as well.
Right. Let's finish this off by talking about the very last slide in that one presentation I keep bringing back to is titled Next Steps. I'd like to hear what the next steps are for this topic. Where do we go from here? We're talking about planning this out and making sure we have these steps in place. What else needs to be worked out from your point of view?
So I think the first step is to come up with a more almost comprehensive picture of the likely workforce we're going to need. So we have talked about a variety of roles and services and functions that are needed. Surely I have not thought of them all, and even a small or large group of people won't have thought of them all unless we engage a rather diverse community: the mining industry, the hotel industry, the air producing people, the sealant community. So I think first we have to get some concepts of, what do the early outpost settlements look like? What do the midterm, where do they eventually grow? And what will we need as people who, when we're done working, what do we want to do? The amenities of life. And then I think we need to engage the sources of the potential trainers and teachers of those skills. I happen to be a big fan that those are going to come a lot out of community colleges and the skills programs, sometimes started in high school. I think if somebody's in the trades industry right now, then their child or maybe their grandchild, if they follow in those footpaths, they got a good chance of being a plumber or a carpenter or a fiberglass materials operator in outer space in 5 or 10 or 25 years.
Mm. Well, Ron, you've been great. This has been a very interesting chat. Very illuminating. I hope the listeners are happy with the question that we asked. I know we got one or two others, but I think that was probably the one that summarized what most people were talking about. And it's been great to actually get this subject talked about on the show. It's been one of the topics that's been on the list to tackle since we first started.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to getting any feedback. Thanks.
Hey folks, hope you enjoyed the episode. Big shout out to John Boswell of Symphony of Science for making the music that you're currently listening to. Check him out at symphonyscience.com. And a huge shout out to Nick LaCrome, our $10 Patreon. If you want to support the show, you want to make sure we get really great guests, and you want to make sure we have all the equipment we need, and get a little something for yourself in the form of early episodes, monthly hangouts, and all kinds of crazy stuff, go to www.patreon.com/Voices from L5 or follow the link below in the box accompanying this website. Or if you just want to know a little bit about the show, go to Twitter and check us out at Voices from L5.